Good evening. My name is Catherine Schmidt. I'm the Science Communication Specialist with Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. We are the park's primary partner in science and education. We are based at Winter Harbor, the site of the former US Navy base. We are now the largest of 18 research learning centers across the national park system. Our mission is to inspire science, learning, and community for a changing world. Tonight, we are very thrilled to have with us Abe Miller-Rushing, Science Coordinator for Acadia National Park, and he's going to talk to us about biodiversity in Acadia yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Abe, we're so glad to have you with us.
Thanks a bunch, Catherine. Really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for coming today. So I want to start by acknowledging that I'm going to be talking about work that's very much a team effort. So some of the folks that have contributed a lot are here on the title slide, but there's a lot more than just that that aren't, and several of them I'll try to mention during the talk, but I definitely won't be able to address all of them. But it's very much a team effort. And just to give you a view of the outline for the talk, I'm going to start by talking about biodiversity and Acadia's origins, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about recognizing change that's been happening and how we initially and I think impressively responded, but now how we're changing up our approach now based on some of the early results of that work. And before I really get going, I want to acknowledge that I'm going to start the story in the 1880s, but the history of this place is much longer, and the history of people in Acadia, so the Wabanaki people in particular, whose territory Acadia is on, have had a much longer relationship with this land and a much longer understanding of the ecology of this area. And that understanding is still being carried out today. We have two exciting Indigenous science projects going on in the park right now, and I would encourage you to find out more about those with Suzanne Greenlaw or Bonnie Newsom and others, if you have a chance. But I'm going to start this story with Charles Elliott and the Champlain Society in 1880. So in 1880, Charles Elliott, who is a Harvard student, asked his dad if he could borrow the family boat and take off and take some of his friends up to Mount Desert Island, where his family had vacationed while he was growing up. And his dad said, you know, you can borrow the family boat. That's okay, but as long as you do something productive while you're up there. And so he took 13 of his buds and they camped. You can actually see their campsite here in what is now Northeast Harbor on Mount Desert Island. And they formed different departments and actually did science during their summer on Mount Desert Island. And they actually wrote reports. This is the ichthyological department report. They had other departments, botanical department, geological, ornithological, and whatnot. And they really did some of the initial Western science on Mount Desert Island. And they recognized, it didn't take them very long to recognize the importance of the place and the value of it, and the importance that it be protected. And you can see a quote from one of their reports here by Charles Elliott. And so they did a lot of really important science over their time. And so Edward Rand and John Redfield, and they partnered with some local residents on this work. And so Edward Rand and John Redfield in particular documented the entire flora of Mount Desert Island. And so nearly 1,500 species of plants. And so this became a really important resource that I'll come back to later. And they kept returning that group for 10 years. And so a lot of their work is still around and actually has been recently published. Catherine, who is doing the introduction, helped do a lot of that work, and the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. And so I encourage you to look at their website and their recent publications. You can explore their work a lot more. But it turns out that their work inspired the creation of Acadia National Park. So Charles Elliott's dad, Charles W. Elliott, and partnered with George Dorr and John D. Rockefeller, inspired by some of the early science that Champlain Society group of Harvard kids did. They protected Acadia National Park. So it was entirely privately kind of acquired land, and then that was donated to the National Park Service, to the US government, to form Acadia National Park. And so this is a park that was inspired by citizen science. And in fact, we're one of the only national parks that has science written right into our founding legislation. For part of the reason we're created was to provide a place to study the flora, the fauna, and geology of the island. So we have a very long history of science. And one of the things I want to mention here is that early in, as Acadia was created and early in the history, actually throughout much of the history of the National Park Service, we had a vision of what we were trying to do was protect national parks as vignettes of primitive America. So we wanted to keep them in historical conditions. And for the most part, national parks envision this as being pre-European contact. And this will, I'll give away a little bit of the punchline in a little bit, that it turns out we have not done a very good job of that. Acadia is not a vignette of primitive America. But so the bottom line of this kind of first section is that science and citizen science were really instrumental in Acadia's creation, and that the initial management goals were to maintain our historical conditions. And so the next element, and so you'll notice as I go along here, I'm kind of going through some stories of some of the key people. So we started with the Champlain Society, which was a group of college students in the 1880s, and we'll move forward 100 years to the 1980s. And another college student, Glenn Middlehauser, at this time was an undergraduate at College of the Atlantic here in Bar Harbor. And he, in the 1980s, he was super interested in natural history and was particularly passionate about plants, and started a passion project with his advisor at the time, Greg Green, and started documenting the flora, repeating that work that Rand and Redfield had done back with the Champlain Society. And so he started that as an undergrad, and on his own free time in large part. And he continued that work, but he had lots of distractions along the way because there was not a lot of funding to repeat that plant survey. In fact, we hired him. He's actually there in a Park Service uniform, second from the left in the back row there, with our first Earthwatch group here in Acadia. This is a group of citizen science. These are teachers actually coming to inventory the biodiversity of islands around the park. And Glenn really helped us lead that effort, which is being revisited actually recently. And so, Glenn continued this work. He continued to do lots of other natural history work. He started a business, started a family, kept on keeping on with the flora in the background, and eventually, in just a few years ago, about maybe 10 years ago, he kind of finished this flora and created the plants of Acadia National Park. And so we ended up having a brand new resurvey done on a lot on volunteer time. Again, a version of citizen science along the way, resurveying the flora. And so we were able to see this change. And we were pretty surprised that even though Acadia was protected over most of that time, so from 1916, it was a national park, and until the late 2000s, over that time, 1 out of every 6 of the native plant species that were in the park no longer occur here. So 1 out of every 6 of the plant species that were here when the Champlain Society were doing their thing don't occur here anymore. And that's mostly orchids and lilies and mints, kind of largely disappeared. And in their place, we have a more non-native species kind of replacing them. And it turns out that there's a lot of other change that's been happening, science around the same time. So a lot of our seabird populations have been declining there on the top left, in part because of mismatches with their food resources, but there are other threats as well. In the bottom left, you can see earlier bioblitzes that have happened here, looking at insects. And through those bioblitzes, they documented over 500 new insect species occurring in the park. And we know that some of those were almost certainly here for a long time, but many of them are brand new. We're confident, actually, many of them are new records to the state. Over 200 of them are new records to the state. And so we know that the insect community has really been changing. We know that from lake cores in the top right, that this change has been going on for a very long time, both in terms of chemistry and our plant communities. And then on the bottom right, we know from looking at our lakes that the phytoplankton and other plant and animal communities in our lakes have been changing a lot as well. And climate change is a really big driver of that change. And so I'm going to go through a few of the ways that the park has changed in terms of climate. Along the x-axis here, the bottom axis, it's years. So you can see going back to the 1890s to the 2010s. And temperatures here have warmed by about 3 degrees, which is about spot on with the global average. But a key thing to note here is that there's a lot of variability, that not every year is sequentially warmer. We still have years as cool as they were in the 1950s, which makes it, not every year is the hottest year on record, but we do have a lot of the hottest years on record recently. And just to put that in perspective, that the warming expected here, 3 degrees doesn't necessarily sound like a lot, but the warming expected in Acadia by the 2080s, which is about 4.5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. If you compare that to the warming since the last glacial maximum, when there was about a mile of ice on top of Acadia, is about 8 degrees. So the warming we're expecting by the 2080s is about the same as the amount of warming it took to turn Acadia from a mile of ice into what we see now. So even though it doesn't necessarily sound like a lot, it has really big implications. We're also getting wetter. So this is the same kind of graph as the temperature one, except with precipitation. And so you can see that we're getting about 6 inches more rain every year on average. But again, there's a lot of variability. We still get dry years. But on average, we're getting wetter. And that rain is happening more in big rainstorms. So extreme rainfall events that used to occur every 50 years now occur every 12 years, or maybe even more frequently. We just had one on Tuesday that led to washouts like this, which is right by, actually, I think maybe somebody on the call mentioned that they're like right next to where this happened. And so this is right off on the Schoodic Peninsula in Birch Harbor. And so we had over 4 inches of rain in 3 hours. And in some places we had more than 6 inches of rain in that 3 hours, which, really overwhelmed a lot of roads and culverts and led to a lot of washouts on our historic carriage roads and other things. And you can imagine that this is not only bad for the roads, but bad for the stream, because that road ended up in the stream, in the river, and that happened at all these washout locations. Ocean is acidifying more rapidly now than it has at any time in the last 300 million years. And that's as far back as we can look right now. And that's tough for anything that creates a shell, because as the pH gets more acidic, it gets harder for species to grab calcium and create shells out of it, especially when they're in their larval stages, just growing. And climate change is also helping non-native invasive species move in and damage ecosystems. So this is like the purple loosestrife here. The monarch is native, totally native, got nothing against. monarchs, love monarchs, but the purple loosestrife, which I'll come back to in a bit too, is and deer, black-legged ticks or deer ticks at the bottom. They're moving in large part because they can survive the warmer winters better now, and they can take really good advantage of the longer growing seasons that we have. And there's big phenological shakeups happening as well. And so plants are fruiting earlier as a result of kind of warming temperatures. They're flowering and fruiting earlier. There's a lot of variation. Some species are flowering a lot earlier, some a little bit, but on average, they're fruiting earlier. But these songbirds are migrating later on average in the fall, to the point that, you know, some of them may be becoming mismatched with their favorite fruit resources that they use to fuel their fall migration south. And then the raptors, some of which feed on songbirds during their fall migration, are migrating at the same time each year. And so you can imagine that with all these species changing their timings, the interactions of them are changing. Some winning, some losing, and leading to this big shakeup and a lot of the changes that we're seeing. And so in all these ways, climate change is really contributing to really big changes that we're seeing. And they're dramatic, even though they're not always visible. So the postcards here in Acadia largely look the same as they have in the past. But we know that the ecosystems are really different now. And for those people who are looking closely, they know that for sure. And so we have to respond, but how do we do that? And so that's where we come to our next section, thinking about about our initial and impressive response. Hopefully you'll be impressed too. But this is a story of another college student, or Judy at this point was just coming out of grad school. So she was fresh off a master's degree in 1986, about the same time that Glenn was starting his natural history work as an undergraduate. But she was coming out out of grad school and getting her first job here at Acadia. And at that same time, another grad student had just finished up a research project in invasive species. People were just recognizing really what invasive species were all about, and that they could displace. These are plants or animals that reproduce so much that they end up displacing native species and kind of harming ecosystem functions. And so this other grad student had finished up a project and identified purple loosestrife and said, it looks like it's an invasive plant, and it's been documented in other places, and in this one wetland it seems to be causing a lot of problems. And so I think 1 year of treatment ought to take care of it. And so Judy was put on the job, and it was one of her first gigs here at Acadia was to manage that. Little did she know that she was setting herself on what would become a project that spanned her 30+ year career here at Acadia. So she started managing the purple loosestrife, but it didn't take her very long to realize that it was going to take more than 1 year. It turns out that each of these plants produces more than 1 million seeds each year, and so it takes a lot of effort to pull it, and then to pull up all the new ones that are popping up from the seed bank. And so Judy, being the tenacious woman she is, recognized we really need to step up our effort. And so we really became really aggressive and used the tools that the Park Service really doesn't use very often, like herbicide. And we really only turn to that as a tool when we think that the invasive plant species is going to do more damage than the herbicide. But we are very careful about applying it. In the picture on the left, it's a drip applicator, so it's not actually a spray, it's just being dripped on the individual plants. On the right, it's actually being applied by a glove. So the ranger has to actually touch each individual plant, kind of in a little bit of dark humor. It's sometimes referred to as a glove of death. But so it turns out that really worked. We were able to knock down, Judy and her crew were able to knock back the purple loosestrife pretty well. But as they became more educated about invasive plants and they started looking more and more, the more they looked, the more they found. And so they found garlic mustard, oriental bittersweet, Japanese barberry, glossy buckthorn. And so it turned out we had lots of invasive plants, and they started realizing this is a really big problem and it's going to take a lot of effort. And it's not obvious that we are going to be able to really really control these invasive plants. And at the same time, we were tackling a lot of other problems as well as a park. We were beginning to restore peregrine falcon populations there on the left that have been really decimated by DDT. We were starting to deal with acid rain pollution, and we were also recognizing that we had a lot of mercury pollution in our fish. And so we had a lot of challenges and a lot of things pulling our resource management staff in different directions. And we were faced with this question: is the invasive plant problem too much? And should we refocus our effort on these other things? And again, Judy was not about to give up, and Judy was doing some of the early evidence-based resource management at a time where it was not actually common practice to look at or to collect evidence of how well your management practice was doing. This is one of the kinds of graphs that Judy was collecting. It's certainly not the only data, but these are data from transects looking at the effectiveness of control for purple loosestrife. And so you can see here that from the 80s to the 2000s, their crew was really able to cut down on the populations of the purple loosestrife, and she was confident they could do that for these other species as well. And so she was able to convince the park leadership to actually double down and actually increase investment in invasive plant management and hire more people each year and actually get more volunteers, also with support from Friends of Acadia and their volunteer program. And really has created, I think, one of the most successful invasive species management programs in the Eastern United States. At this point, we're largely managing kind of new invasions or re-invasions. So most of the invasive species populations are under pretty good control in the park, which felt awesome. So we were all patting ourselves on the back. Woo! Great job, us. And I mean, not like royal us. It was definitely not me at that time. But it turns out, right when we were really celebrating, there were other issues coming up, and invasive insects, which are a whole lot. We had been paying a little bit less attention. We were definitely knew they were around. We were paying a little bit less attention, and they're just harder to control. But one caught us pretty darn off guard, and this was the red pine scale. And so here on Norumbega Mountain, just above Sargent Drive, you can see these kind of brown, it's a little bit hard to see, but brown, dead red pines. So over the past 6 years, basically all of the red pines in Acadia have died because of this red pine scale, which is an invasive insect from East Asia. And so we learned pretty quickly that, it was kind of a reminder that we really can't preserve this vignette of primitive America. We can do a lot to stop change, and we can even be successful at stopping a lot of the invasive plants or holding them at bay, but we really can't stop the changes. So we have to really shift to this change and preserve So we have to change our approach and preserve ecological and historical integrity and resilience. We have to kind of manage this change, which is a big change for us. And so I'm going to shift now to kind of what our new approach is, and our new folks, no longer college students. So our Kevin Schneider and Rebecca Cole-Will. Kevin Schneider is our park superintendent, and Rebecca Cole-Will. So they have the unenviable job, and I guess the rest of our staff, and certainly those at Schoodic Institute who are helping us a lot on this work, as well as with Friends of Acadia and other partners. we're faced with this task of how do we, as we're managing change, how do we actually continue to accomplish our mission? And so the Park Service's mission is to, preserve our natural and cultural resources unimpaired for this and future generations. So we're in the forever business, but how the heck do we do that? How do we keep these places unimpaired forever as they change? That is not an easy thing, and I don't really actually even have a good answer for it, but I will tell you what we're trying. So we're really rethinking our management policies to think about how do we think about unimpaired resources as they change. And we're working on a new framework. So this framework of thinking about when we should resist change, when we should accept change, and when we should direct change to kind of future change. And I should say that this is a framework that's been developed by a team of folks. Actually, Nick Fisichella, the CEO of Schoodic Institute, is one of the co-authors of the Park Service report that sets out this framework for the agency. And so I'm going to go through an example of how we're thinking about this in our forest restorations and some of how we're thinking about the changes in the biodiversity of our forests going forward. And so our forests are pretty healthy right now. They're mostly spruce, red spruce specifically. We actually have some of the healthiest forests in all of the Northeast US, which is awesome. We're very proud of our forests here in Acadia. And just so you can see our top 10 most common tree species here, you can see that almost 40% of our trees are red spruce. And then we have a lot of red maple and white cedar and fir and on down the list. And so of these 10 most common tree species in Acadia, 9 of them are anticipated to decline or disappear entirely based on their habitat suitability in 2100. So based on what we think the climate will likely be then, and what kinds of climate these guys like. For instance, red spruce really is drought intolerant. So as things get warmer and we have periods of drought, the red spruce is likely to decline. And again, this is work that Nick Fisichella helped lead. But you can imagine that this means that we're gonna have a really big transition in our forests over the next 80 years. And how do we prepare for that? So what does that look like if we accept this change and just kind of be hands-off, which is the historic way that the Park Service, not us necessarily in Acadia, but the Park Service in general, tends to be hands-off on a lot of things. And so what we're concerned about, and we're concerned about those invasive species that we've been spending so much energy trying to control. And we only have to look to national parks to our south. This is Morristown National Historic Site in northern New Jersey. And you can see this is time lapse. I'm going to show 3 time lapse photos from the same plot, where in 2009, you can see this is Japanese barberry, the invasive shrub in the understory, 2009. Then 4 years later, it's kind of growing in a little bit more dense. And then 4 years on, it's totally covering the forest floor and choking out. There's no regeneration of the forest trees. And without aggressive management, this forest is likely to shift to being primarily a shrubland rather than kind of a hardwood forest. And that's what we think will likely happen here if we are hands-off with our management approach. So we think that accepting this kind of change really isn't an acceptable kind of change. So we would like a different kind of change in our biodiversity here. And so we're thinking about resisting. And we're thinking about this largely in terms of buying time, because we know we're not going to be able to do it forever. And so we're continuing to remove our invasive plants. Here, we're continuing to invest in that going forward. And we're also looking at protecting climate change refugia. So these are places that are going to warm slower than other places. And it turns out Acadia National Park is well situated and probably has historically served as a climate change refugia. And particularly our coasts and our summits and a lot of our wetlands are likely to warm more slowly than a lot of the surrounding landscape. And so we'll provide refugia for species as conditions warm. And so we'll continue to protect those areas and try to allow species to continue to persist there as conditions warm. In other places, we are thinking about directing change. And right now, we're not making active management decisions to actually do the directing of change, but we're doing a lot of science to inform our decision making when we have to make those decisions to direct change. And what does that look like? So one very common way that people think about directing change is moving species. So managed relocation is the act of moving a plant or animal from say a southern location, from say Massachusetts or New Jersey or Virginia, that wouldn't necessarily moving it up here. And the reason we might do that is because we've actually, well, one, climate change is moving faster than these plants can keep up with, and two, people have set up a lot of obstacles to prevent like cities and development, so that plants aren't able to expand their habitat northward to keep pace with climate change. And so as we're thinking about doing managed relocation, we have worked with a lot of other partners in developing a risk assessment tool to think about the risks associated with managed relocation and when it might make sense and when it may not make sense. Nick's been very popular in this talk so far. He's done a lot of the work, but he's set up a number of experiments where testing out growing some of these species from the south alongside some of our native species in these raised test beds here in Acadia and also throughout the state of Maine at college campuses, and as well as in land trust lands and other protected areas to see how they would perform. Which species survive, how well do they grow, which species do too well and look like they might be invasive. So we don't want to plant them, we wouldn't want to move them. And so we're kind of looking for the Goldilocks species. And again, looking for testing out the techniques. So if we decide to move these species northward, what techniques might work? What species might we think about doing this with? We've also Alessio Mortelliti, former second century stewardship fellow with the Schoodic Institute and at the University of Maine, has also looked at the role of seed predators. So trees don't just move here and interact with themselves; they also interact with with squirrels and chipmunks and voles and other things that are seed predators. And what role do those guys play because they may eat those seeds and prevent those trees from reproducing, or they may actually cache and essentially plant those seeds and help them disperse. And it turns out that these squirrels and other things actually look like they're going to help things, particularly with when they have large hard seeds. So oaks and hickories are particularly well suited for these guys. We also have other folks like Chris Nadeau, another former second century stewardship fellow, working with developing model ecosystems. So these are actually rock pools, which I can say that I had no idea what they were really before Chris got here. These are essentially puddles, freshwater pools just above the intertidal on our coast. He did his work especially on the Schoodic Point, but there are other areas of the park as well, kind of rain-fed pools that have their own mini ecosystems. And so he was able to replicate. And some of these pools are sun exposed, so they're really warm. Some are shady, and so they're cooler, so they have nice climate gradients. And he can reproduce them in these tubs out on the landscape and manipulate their climate. And what is really great about these systems is it becomes a way to look at how whole ecosystems might respond to climate change. And we can actually test some of our management actions like managed relocation without threatening our natural ecosystems. Because we can reproduce these in tubs in the lab and see how they behave. And we're also working with communities and partners. Managing for change is a new big change that requires a lot of value judgments and a lot of working with local communities. What do we want? What kind of change are we okay with? What kind of change are we not okay with? So there's a lot of values in here, and we need to have a lot of conversations with scientists, with students, with people that use the landscape, with other partner agencies like state agencies and whatnot. And we're also, as we're learning more and more, we're starting to scale these things up and actually start 3 big restorations as a part of a Wild Acadia initiative with friends of it, led by Friends of Acadia, but with a number of partners on the project, looking at restoring habitats on our summits, on 3 of our summits, on Cadillac Mountain and Sargent Mountain and Penobscot, as well as in areas of Bass Harbor Marsh and in Great Meadow which is in the Sourdemont area. And in these areas, we're going to test different approaches to how to restore, so that not to past conditions, because we know those are gone. And so how can we restore these areas so that species will thrive and these areas will remain healthy in the next 50 to 100 years? And we set this stage for the species and ecosystems to kind of adapt to the changing conditions. And we're really working at telling this story, because this is a conversation that needs to be had locally as well as nationally. Like, we really need, as a whole society, to be having this conversation. And so we've been working, Catherine's actually been leading a lot of coverage locally here in the local press, and been writing a lot herself, like this Understory series, which I strongly encourage you to read. It's awesome, and a lot of other news stories on the Schoodic Institute website, and other venues. And then also working with the national press, especially recently, coverage in the New York Times and other places. That's actually a photo in the New York Times of some of our restoration plots on Cadillac Mountain, where we're doing a lot of experimentation, seeing how we can get things to survive up there. And so we're really doing the science and having the conversation so that we can make informed decisions to keep Acadia's ecosystems healthy for future generations, and have changes, make the changes in biodiversity and help them to be positive, healthy changes in biodiversity, or at least as healthy as we can make it. And you can really help in this, and you have a strong role. I tried to highlight it, but I probably didn't highlight it enough. A lot of the data that I would venture to say that most of the data that we have documenting the changes that I highlighted earlier in the talk, changes in biodiversity in particular, come from citizen science. So come from people making these observations in their free time, and unpaid, and that'll become even more important now, using apps like iNaturalist or eBird or Nature's Notebook. I think in tomorrow's event, on the Schoodic Peninsula, you'll be mostly using iNaturalist, but the Park Service uses all 3 of these apps, and you can use these on your own, here in Acadia, or even at your home. The National Park Service, all national parks use data from these 3 apps, and scientists around the world use them no matter where those data are collected. And I should mention that you heard earlier, like Glenn Middlehauser, the Champlain Society made their observations in the 1880s, and then Glenn started his observations in the 1980s, 100 years between those. But climate change is really changing so fast now. We need these much more observations of much more species going forward, which is part of the reason why we're really trying to ramp up our efforts. documenting these changes and need your help doing it. And so really continue this tradition. I encourage you to continue this tradition. Acadia was founded largely based on citizen science. It's a part of our DNA here in Acadia, part of our reason for being, and really encourage you to be a part of this effort, and really thank you for many of you I know have actually already been contributing to this, and we really, really appreciate it. So thank you, and with that, I'll be glad to take any questions that folks have.
Thank you, Abe. That was great. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, and I'll just recap. You're welcome to type your question in. You can just send it into the chat. You're welcome to send it to me privately if you want. And we can also, we're a small enough group that I think if you want to use the raise hand feature, I can call on you. And so we can have a little discussion if you'd prefer that. But a couple of questions to start. So Anne is asking about coordination with other national parks, sharing information and sort of ideas about some of the impressive work that you talked about, and some of the restoration work. So how are you communicating with and collaborating with other parks? Or how does that communication happen?
With other parks about our restoration work?
Yes.
Yeah, so it happens in a lot of ways. So the Park Service, even though there are 400 some odd national park units, it's a small world, even though there are a lot of us, and so a lot of us are friends, and so we chat that way, and a lot of this, there's an active conversation right now. So there's a lot of conversation, particularly around this resist, accept, direct kind of new framework is being directed by a group or facilitated by a group that has an obnoxious name called FedNet, which I won't go into, but it's a partnership of across federal agencies, particularly within the Department of Interior, so BLM and the Fish and Wildlife Service and National Park Service, thinking about, because we're all faced with this decision, right? We all are working on the ground. We have to, we're restoring degraded habitats, and we all know that it doesn't make any sense to restore these back to these past conditions. And so we're all trying to figure out, how do we think about this? How do we make decisions? And so we talk together and commiserate a lot. So there's a lot of those kind of informal conversations, as well as formal conversations that happen at conferences and meetings and workshops. So there is a lot of conversation across parks.
There's a good follow-up question to that from Michael, who says that the National Park Service has a unique position to inform the public about climate change. And what is Acadia doing to communicate these changes to the public? Michael says, the New York Times is nice, but not everybody reads
it. Yeah. I mean, I would say we have done a fair amount to communicate, but I would also say that is probably one of the areas that we need to invest more in going forward. That we, it's actually hard to communicate too much about this. There are audiences that we really need to engage more. And like I said, especially where we're making these decisions around how do we manage change, we really need, they're not just science decisions. So science will definitely inform it, but a lot of it's value judgment. And so we need the public to know what's going on. And so some of the things we're doing is interacting with the press, a lot of different media, and trying to tell our stories and trying to work with partners who can then also go on and tell these stories. I think as we do that, hopefully, over the next several years, the conversation will spread and spread and spread. That's our hope. And the National Park Service actually has a nice role that we reach broader audiences than a lot of other venues, and we're more trusted than other venues, but we do still know as an agency that we do not hit equally all the segments of the American population, and we're taking steps to try to improve that going forward, and reaching out to partners who do have the ear of different audiences more than we do.
I actually had a question about going back to sort of the early part of your presentation about the 1 in 6 plants that are no longer here. Do we know why they're no longer here?
So obviously, I mean, we can't go back and do experiments to say exactly why, but we can rule out some things. One, most of the area was protected, and so it almost certainly wasn't mostly habitat loss. And we also know that that the species were lost kind of equally across all habitat types. So our forests lost about the same proportion of their species, as did wetlands, as did streams, as did kind of grassland open habitats. And that same kind of pattern happened across New England. So before coming here, I did similar kind of work in Concord, Massachusetts. And they had similar kinds of losses there. And Caitlin McDonough McKenzie, who's at Colby College now, has done similar kinds of work, and so showing that this pattern is across New England, and that really suggests that it's largely likely climate change driven, and or nitrogen pollution driven, things that are happening kind of equally across the landscape. But climate change is almost certainly one of the primary drivers for that loss.
We have another question from Anne, and thanks for asking this, Anne, because I've asked the same question of Caitlin, whom Abe just mentioned, but is there sort of a poster child plant was my question, but or animal that's sort of that we can use to engage, that's already being used, or that we can use to engage the public to sort of help protect habitat that's vulnerable to climate change. So she's thinking of pikas in the West and the Shenandoah salamander in Shenandoah National Park.
Yeah. That's a good question. I think here we're starting to talk more about red spruce that way, which is kind of interesting because it's not rare. But we're at the southern edge of its range, and it likely, it has some obvious vulnerabilities, and it's the dominant thing in our landscape. It's a lot of what you think about when you think about a postcard of Acadia. A lot of times you think of the red spruce along a rocky coast. A lot of people don't necessarily know that that's red spruce in the photo, but that's what it is. And so I think that that's one species that we could think about. I think throughout New England, being a plant person, a wildflower person, I tend to think, the losses of our orchids and lilies, and also across a lot of New England goldenrods and asters, those are some of our what historically have been kind of charismatic wildflowers of New England that have been lost. There's still some around for sure, but a lot there've been big declines. In terms of animals, I have a harder time thinking about. I would turn to others. What do you guys in the audience? Feel free to suggest in the chat what you think would be good animals. There's almost certainly a butterfly out there that would be a good example, or something. I'm sure Seth would suggest a bird.
I would say brook trout.
Oh yeah, there you go. Yeah, brook trout need cold water for sure. So they're
think of some of those other species that in the Refugia study, there was American bittern and the mink frog. Right.
Even loons, we know are going to be sensitive to climate, and yeah, so they're moose also. Moose doesn't end up being a great flagship project or species for us in Acadia, because we don't really have moose. They pass through every once in a while, but their ranges are going to be very sensitive to climate.
A lot of people say, I don't know if you can see the chat, Abe, but people are suggesting birds, maybe a shorebird. Someone else is countering no land birds. There's a question. Nick says, my daughter wants to know, can we continue to live as we do and mitigate climate change?
No. It was kind of interesting. I was having a conversation with our superintendent earlier today, and he was pointing out that the pace of climate change, he was putting it in terms of scientists have been wrong in predicting how rapid things are going to change, and that temperatures seem to be warming at the high end of what scientists have predicted, and that's really because most of the variability, when you see the projections of future climate change that happen in the news or magazines or wherever, most of the variability between the bottom end, the least warm end and the most warm end, is based on human behavior, and the end of the models that shows the least warming assumes that we're going to take action to mitigate climate change, and even then we still are warming, but we haven't really taken very many actions to mitigate climate change. And so that's the main reason why we're at the high end of the models. And so I would say that, no, we can't really continue to live. We have to change a lot about society, and really reduce our carbon footprints in order to mitigate climate change.
Following up on that, Pamela asks, what is one change people can make to lessen climate change?
So that's the forever question. So there are things you can do as an individual. Really, the best thing is to become more civically engaged, or maybe many of you, I'm sure, actually already are, but get engaged in local decisions, and local organizations that are working on climate change issues. Helping local towns make decisions to reduce their carbon footprints can really help. There are individual decisions that you can make as an individual too, to reduce your own carbon footprint largely by traveling less and things like that, but really by becoming more engaged, I think. And then citizen science to help us document the impacts of climate change and to tell that story. Actually, yes, I often hear one of the very most important things is to talk about climate change. So become civically engaged, talk about it, and do citizen science. I would say would be the three biggies.
Yeah, I think paying attention. So we do have a citizen science event tomorrow, and also throughout the whole summer. And Abe, you've been, I think, a leader in citizen science nationally, and I'm just sort of curious, because I agree. I think paying attention is one of the best things you can do, because if we don't pay attention, we don't know what it is that we're saving and protecting, and that's where the motivation and the joy comes from. And so I'm curious about, you've seen this shift from, so in 2004 there was those bioblitzes at Schoodic, so big one-day multi-day events where people go out and collect species, and then we recently shifted in about 2016 to using the online platforms like iNaturalist. And I'm just interested in your sort of seeing this, the field of citizen science and engagement with it evolve over time. Why do you think it's been so successful? So we've had, since switching to iNaturalist, we've had 8,000 people contribute 60,000 observations of 4,500 plus species to iNaturalist alone. And I actually, just in the past week, I've talked to 2 scientists who say they use iNaturalist to help them with their fieldwork. So Chris Nadeau used it to help find the plant that he's studying. And another researcher who studies sea stars uses it to find her study sites. And I didn't realize that even scientists were relying on it. And I just, from sort of the participants' perspective of things, do you think that the move to the online platform has helped bring more people into science?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, even those climate refugia models that I showed earlier, like iNaturalist and eBird went into those models to identify the climate refugia. So they're hugely valuable sources of data. And in fact, the at this point, so internationally, right, there's biodiversity data. We have international treaties like the Convention on Biodiversity to monitor biodiversity and to help preserve it globally. And at this point, the vast majority of data that are going into these international databases, which is how we're tracking biodiversity globally, is through citizen science, like iNaturalist and eBird. I think iNaturalist and eBird may actually be the two biggest contributors to those international databases. So agencies around the world are relying on those data more and more, and it's really important because we're having to make all of these protected areas all over the world are having to make these decisions about how do we manage change. And in order to think about how we manage this change, we have to understand what's happening, and we haven't historically been monitoring as closely enough to really have a great handle on that. Like I said, here in Acadia, one of the best studied places, still most of our data describing changes in biodiversity comes from citizen science. And so we really need to rely on that. And I think that why it's grown a lot, citizen science, is a lot because I think people, well, one it's fun. I think that's probably actually the main reason, is because it's fun. You know, some people do it as groups, some people do it, some people love identifying stuff, and there's a sense of contribution, and you can get this kind of feedback, and different people have their different reasons, but it's fun, it contributes, there can be feedback, it can be social, or you can do it on your own if you want. And it's these online databases become online ways for you to keep your own journals. What people used to keep on index cards, like a lot of people used to track down, a surprising number of people used to write down what they saw on their walks in little index cards and shoe boxes they kept in shoe boxes. And now you can do it using these apps on your phone, and share it with other people. But it's really exciting to see, and it's a way for people to actually see the changes that are happening in our landscape.
I just put a link in the chat to the Landscape of Change project, where we're really encouraging people to get out this summer and revisit and revise the Champlain Society data sets. We're especially, so if you already contribute to iNaturalist and eBird, or you want to, we're especially looking for observations of birds and pollinators, so butterflies, moths, and bees. So please help us document those. Thank you everybody for spending an hour of your Friday evening with us. Thank you so much, Abe. It was a great presentation. We are recording this and we'll be posting it shortly, probably early next week. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Really appreciate it. And appreciate all that you're contributing to keeping Acadia healthy.
Have a great night.